My worker complained about the lazy owner for 45 minutes, not knowing I was the owner he talked about. I walked into the break room at my manufacturing plant wearing jeans and an old college hoodie, carrying my lunch in a paper bag like I always did. I'd owned this company for 15 years after buying it from my mentor who'd taught me everything about the business, and I made it a point to dress like everyone else when I visited the floor. No fancy suits or executive badges, just comfortable clothes that let me blend in and see how things really ran when nobody knew the boss was watching. I spotted an empty seat at one of the long tables and sat down next to a guy I'd seen around but never formally met. He was maybe mid-30s with a perpetual scowl and was already mid-conversation with two other workers across from us. I nodded hello and started unwrapping my sandwich while they continued talking about last night's game. The conversation was normal enough until the guy next to me, whose name tag read Dennis, suddenly shifted topics and started complaining about management. Dennis launched into a rant about how the owner never showed his face on the floor and probably sat in his office counting money all day while real workers busted their backs. The two guys across from us nodded along, clearly having heard this speech before. I kept my expression neutral and took a bite of my sandwich, listening carefully as Dennis described in detail how he imagined I spent my days. According to him, I rolled into work around noon in a luxury car, took 3-hour lunches at expensive restaurants, and left by 4 without ever setting foot in the actual plant. He said the owner clearly didn't care about the people who made him rich, and probably couldn't even operate the machinery if his life depended on it. One of the other guys mentioned he'd heard the owner was some rich kid who inherited the business, which wasn't true at all since I'd bought it with money I'd saved from working 2 jobs for a decade. But I didn't correct him, just kept eating and listening while Dennis got more animated with each complaint. He was really warming up now, gesturing with his sandwich, and raising his voice enough that people at nearby tables were starting to glance over. Dennis went on to say that the owner probably didn't even know half the workers' names, and definitely didn't appreciate how hard everyone worked to keep production numbers up. He complained about the lack of raises this year, which stung because we'd actually given modest increases to 70% of the staff based on performance reviews. I knew not everyone got raises because not everyone deserved them, but apparently Dennis felt entitled to more money regardless of his contribution. He started listing all the ways he thought the owner was incompetent, including the recent decision to upgrade our quality control systems, which Dennis called a waste of money that could have gone to worker bonuses. I happened to know that quality control upgrade had already caught 3 major defects that would have cost us a huge client contract, but Dennis clearly didn't have that information. His buddy across the table asked if Dennis had ever actually seen the owner, and Dennis snorted and said he wouldn't recognize him if he walked right past him in the hallway. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat there 6 inches from his elbow, drinking my water and letting him continue. The rant continued for another 10 minutes as Dennis described how he'd been working at the plant for 8 months and had never once received recognition for his contributions. He said he worked harder than anyone else on his line, and that the owner probably didn't even know his name or care about his excellent attendance record. I made a mental note to check Dennis's file later, because I had a feeling his version of events might not match reality. One of the other workers tried to change the subject, but Dennis was on a roll now, complaining about the break room coffee being cheap and the parking lot needing repaving, and a dozen other issues, both valid and petty. Some of his complaints were actually fair points that I'd already been working on with my operations manager, but others were just whining about normal workplace inconveniences that every company dealt with. Dennis declared that if he ever met the owner face to face, he'd tell him exactly what he thought about how the place was being run, and that someone needed to give the boss a reality check about what actually happened on the floor. The two guys across from us were starting to look uncomfortable now, probably sensing that Dennis was going too far, but he didn't pick up on their body language at all. I finished my sandwich and wadded up the paper bag, still not saying anything while Dennis pivoted to complaining about the company's safety protocols. He called them overkill, and said the owner was probably just worried about lawsuits rather than actually caring about worker safety. This one particularly annoyed me because we'd implemented those protocols after a serious accident at a competitor's plant had injured 3 people, and I'd spent weeks working with safety consultants to make sure our people were protected. Dennis's dismissive attitude toward those measures told me a lot about his judgment and priorities. He went on to say that the owner had probably never worked a real day in his life and wouldn't last 2 hours doing actual manual labor. That's when I couldn't hold myself anymore. The rest of the story is linked below or on my channel.